Welcome to this episode of the Pickle Podcast Investigation, where we take a close look at a certain topic and dissect it in an entertaining way. Today we will be taking a trip to the past and turning back our clocks to the mid-20th century, which is the setting for the Cold War. More specifically, we'll take a look at various forms of propaganda that was used during this period and analyze their influence on the audience. And so this is our driving question. How do governments use propaganda to shape people's ideas about their country and the outside world? But to answer this question, we should take a brief look at the events preceding the Cold War to better understand the Cold War in a historical sense. This way, we can properly interpret the propaganda as it relates to historical developments. First, let's begin with how communism began to take shape in Russia after World War I. During the First World War in 1918, the unhappy people of Russia demanded for a revolution, causing a series of communist revolutions that centered around the mantra of peace, land, and bread, basically calling for an end to World War I, land redistribution, and food. After World War I, communism finally overtakes the Russian monarchy and forms the Soviet Union in its place, which was led by Vladimir Lenin and eventually Joseph Stalin, who comes to power in the newly created Soviet Union. A few decades later, and World War II erupts, and after the dust settles, two superpowers remain standing: the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite being allies during World War II, their inherent ideological differences caused some serious tension between them. Because they were two polar opposites, the US being a capitalist democracy and the Soviet Union being a communist one-party government, a global rivalry was initiated, and thus began the Cold War. Now, one way for the message of these governments to reach its people, whether it be from the US or the Soviet Union, was through the use of propaganda material, which leads us back to our central question. So, how did governments use propaganda to shape people's opinions? Several ways exist, but the ones that were most prominent during the Cold War era were three particular ones. 1. To evoke fear. 2. To incite nationalism for one's country. And 3. To deceive or give false impressions to the audience. The fear comes from scare tactics that are employed in the propaganda. For example, they may try to make the opposing side seem more intimidating. Nationalism is the identification with one's country and or a group of people, and can be used in conjunction with the us versus them mentality. And finally, to deceive or give false impressions is exactly what it sounds like. It's to present imagery or information to convince the audience of one thing or another, but with an inaccurate portrayal. And because the Cold War was a battle between the two major opposing forces, that being capitalism and communism, governments thought it was necessary for its people to support the cause and not to align with the enemy. Let's investigate our first piece of propaganda during the Cold War that will exemplify the points we just made. This poster depicts East Asian nations like Japan and China, allied forces of the US, and the US itself, ganging up on the comparatively small USSR, aka the Soviet Union. The entity known as Western Europe is referring to an international organization called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or known simply as NATO. NATO was comprised of states that stood to prevent Soviet aggression during the Cold War. This map of the world's nations shows the members of NATO in dark blue, most of which are located in Western Europe and North America, while other US allied states are located across South America, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Australia. The formation of this pact was one of just many signs of the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. Later, the Warsaw Pact would be formed in response to NATO. Now back to the propaganda. Despite it being created by an American illustrator, it's meant to illustrate the perspective of the Soviets, since their enemies are represented as being larger and scarier. The use of Uncle Sam, an icon of America, shows the opinion of the Soviets about the West as an imperial power. We can see this as Uncle Sam is menacingly grabbing his way towards the USSR. From this, we can conclude that the propaganda is trying to communicate the unfair situation that the Soviet Union is in, as it's being bullied by these other countries. By showing the enemies of the USSR in a bad light, the propaganda aims to evoke fear of the Soviet Union's enemies, and to shape audiences' opinions on who's the bad guy through the use of name-calling. An exact 180 to the one that we just analyzed would be this piece of propaganda. This piece illustrates the USSR as a large, intimidating bear and a threat to the US, who is tiny in comparison, as it towers over other states and spreads its influence in those regions. Along with the USSR, other communist satellite states came together to form what is known as the Warsaw Pact, a coalition in response to the United States' NATO Pact. Referring to this map again, the states that are a part of the Warsaw Pact are in dark red, as well as other Soviet alliance states that are in red. In many of those regions, such as Vietnam in Southeast Asia and Korea in East Asia, civil wars and communist revolutions broke out to rid of the current establishment, often leading to proxy wars. For example, the Vietnamese communist revolutionary leader, Ho Chi Minh, led the frontier against the French in French Indochina in an attempt to unify the nation. In this conflict, the Soviet Union supplied them with supplies like weapons. At the same time, the US also became involved in the Civil War in order to prevent further spread of communism. These proxy wars demonstrates the cold nature of the Cold War, but also the rivalry that existed between the US and the Soviet Union. Similar to the previous piece, it was made by an American illustrator meant to depict the Cold War situation from an American perspective. This is apparent due to the exaggerated representation of the USSR as a bear who poses a danger to its surroundings. In essence, it's trying to say that Soviet Russia and the communist bloc are dangerous in how they spread their communist influence and ideologies to other places, which led to proxy wars during the Cold War. Again, sharing characteristics to the last, the propaganda seeks to convince people and evoke fear of the Soviet Union's negative influence and also what it stands for, primarily through the use of name-calling. This 1957 propaganda poster, unlike the other pieces that we were viewing, was made for a Russian audience instead of a Western audience. The poster itself promotes the Soviet Union's sixth five-year plan by saying, "We will fulfill the task of the party," in the bold red lettering. Now, the 5-year plan was a significant effort to advance the development of Russia's industry in an extremely short amount of time, pushed heavily by the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The first 5-year plan would involve not just the nationalization of industry, but also collectivization of agriculture, which ultimately led to rapid industrial growth in Russia, though it also had a byproduct of a catastrophic famine that took several millions of Russian lives. With this course of action, Joseph Stalin hoped to compete and exceed Western powers such as the United States, and the fact that it's the sixth effort to achieve this shows their desire to both economically and politically dominate. As it was meant to sway the opinion of Russian people, the propaganda poster was made by Russian artists, likely funded by the centralized Soviet government. Because it's promoting the sixth 5-year plan, the poster was created to encourage the Soviet citizens to participate in the national effort. By utilizing collective terms like party and also the collaborative nature of the project itself, it may incite nationalism among its Soviet citizens, making them work harder and more vigorously towards the goal. In contrast to the previous propaganda piece, this poster is told from an American perspective. It depicts a woman who's in shock and fear from the result that's shown in the image to the right. It says, "Is this tomorrow?" in response to the impending threat of communism to the United States, illustrated by the burning of the American flag and apprehending of US citizens. Again, this supports the conflict that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union, as Western governments and its people feared what may happen if communism were to take hold of the nation. The anti-communist guerrillas, depicted in the blue dots and are stationed in communist regions, symbolize this fear and retaliation against Soviet aggression, who also have communist guerrillas that are aligned with the Soviets in US allied regions. These guerrillas were military operations to both harass and drive out the other's influence in the area. Sometimes the Cold War powers, the US and the Soviet Union, would step in to aid their side. For instance, the communist government in Afghanistan were battling the local anti-communist guerrillas of the same area. The Soviet Union invaded the region to support the communist Afghanistan government, and soon the United States also stepped in the same, to equip the anti-communist guerrillas with weaponry. These guerrillas, which resembled proxy wars of the same era, reinforced the conflict between the Cold War powers, and between their ideologies of a capitalist democracy and a communist one-party system. This poster was told from an American perspective, and their bias is shown through the anti-communist attitude of the propaganda. With that in mind, it helps us to understand the message of this piece, that communism would negatively affect America if it were to get out of hand, harboring destruction to the US democracy and the country at large. Depicting the scenario in this way, the author likely sought to evoke fear in the hearts of the American people. Doing so would instill patriotism in them to help gain the support of US citizens, and possibly non-communist people, to push back against the erosion of communism during the Cold War era. Glancing back over to the Soviet perspective, there's another piece of propaganda promoting the 5-year plan. Here we see a few normal Soviet women that are lining up to join the efforts of the Soviets' 5-year plan, with one woman reaching her arm out and saying, "Soviet women, be the first in line for the national struggle to successfully fulfill the 5-year plan in 4 years," as she invites others to join her. This can be seen as a bandwagon technique to get more women participating in the Soviet campaign. Why the Soviet Union chose to target a female demographic was to expedite the process of the 5-year plan. Women's role in the national campaign was going to be required if it were to succeed, which is why they were more inclined to integrate them into the Soviet industrial society. Looking at this chart, it describes the percentage of women in academia of the Soviet Union during the 1950s. In the first row, we can see a percentage of women who hold a doctorate degree or were doctorate candidates was around 28% of women at this time. Now these are percentages of women with college degrees in the US during the same period, only extending to the year 2000. If we compare the information from this graph and the last, we'll notice the differences between the percentages of degree-holding women in the US and Soviet Union during the 1950s. While there were about 28% of Soviet women who had this type of education, only about 2% of women in the United States had a similar kind. This approximately 26% difference can be pointed to how the USSR created more educational opportunities to the women than the United States at this time, as it would be necessary to realize their hopes to become economically superior. This evidence comes back to why women in particular were a targeted audience for Soviet propaganda. And so, the specifically tailored propaganda aimed to encourage Soviet women to take part in the 5-year plan, and with a sense of urgency too. With this message, the government hoped to instill nationalism in them by identifying with both their country and their fellow female compatriots in order to mobilize them for the 5-year plan. And lastly, an interesting piece of propaganda from yet another Soviet perspective will wrap up our investigation. In it, we can see groups of people of various ethnicities holding hands and dancing around the globe, which at the center is the USSR. A few phrases in the Russian language also hover above the people, all in essence meaning, "We stand for friendship and peace." This observation hints towards what the message of the poster is trying to convey, which is that Soviet influence, and thereby communist influence, will bring friendship and peace wherever it goes. However, this is quite an exaggerated and deceitful depiction of what is historically held true. This propaganda uses a technique called glittering generalities. Propaganda that uses glittering generalities often uses vibrant yet vague words to paint a picture that isn't true to reality. This piece uses that very technique, making it seem like the message of communism has always been a force of goodness. However, places where communism did breed resulted in violence, sometimes involving the nation at large. For example, the Korean War in Korea during the 1950s resulted from a surprise attack from the communist Northern Korea, as it ordered troops to claim the US-controlled Southern Korean capital. This attack began a conflict that pitted communist and capitalist forces against each other that spanned a 3-year period. The result of it demonstrated America's strategy of containing communism to the world so that similar atrocities do not occur elsewhere. By observing this case and others that were mentioned previously, such as the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia, it's clear that communism did not always bring peace and friendship as the propaganda claims. That being said, the Soviet propaganda aimed to improve the appearance of communism and convince its citizens and potential outsiders that the Soviet cause is peaceful and non-hostile. Their message doesn't exactly hold true, yet is presented as so. Therefore, this is an example of how governments use propaganda to to deceive or give false impressions to its people. That was quite a bit to go through, yet it's only taking a snapshot of the extensive propaganda during the Cold War. Although we were able to investigate a few ways this form of media was used by governments and authors with voices to shape people's opinions, especially during the Cold War era. Some strategies that were used in this propaganda was evoking fear, inciting nationalism, and deceiving or giving false impressions to the audience. And even though we're just talking about history, the lessons learned in this episode can be carried to the modern age. Propaganda is still used today and just as prominent, if not more so. The perspective of an author, their message, and its impact will be critical in sifting through potentially deceitful information. Just remember that whatever propaganda is used, we may be the audience, and it's our duty to realize how we may be manipulated by it, and to distinguish facts from fallacies. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed investigating with me this episode of the Pickle Podcast Investigation. Peace out.